Okay, so we are in 1 Timothy chapter 3, and just to remind everybody kind of where we're at in this whole thing. Last week we talked about the role of ladies in the body, and the reason why God basically asked women to kind of submit themselves and subject themselves to men is because men, if you are... Well, all you had to do is be at our class, or not class, but at our party last Sunday, and you'd realize exactly why God did that commandment, because there was no male participation in the gift exchange, if you recall. Not one man was involved, not one. Every one of them basically were like behind the scenes, you know. Yeah, playing the male lion. But as I said, the whole purpose of chapter 2 is to set up chapter 3, and so that's really what he's doing here in this section. So let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get right into it. Father, we do ask your blessing upon this time that we're here together, and each one that's here. Lord, just cause each one to love you and to want to serve you even more. We thank you for Jesus. We pray in his name. So let's get into this little section. We're just going to do the first 7 verses this morning. Okay, so what's Paul talking about here? So Paul is basically now doing something that a lot of people don't really think about, and I'm not sure you would think about it at this point in the history of the church if you weren't the Apostle Paul, frankly, and that is the issue of governance in the church. He clearly had talked and instructed, about what the church should look like and so forth in the other chapters. But when he gets into this one, he's really talking about governance in the church. How should we run the body of believers? What should we look like? Who should be in charge? Who should do what, and so forth. Now, in Ephesians, he says that as far as ministry is concerned, there are 5 basic positions of ministry. He says they are in this order: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors or the shepherds, and teachers, in that order. And the reason that those 5 people or those 5 positions exist is so the saints can be equipped, and so that they can be equipped, so that they can be involved in the service of the church. And those are the things that each one of those. So those are ministerial positions. Everybody see that? So you have apostles, and you have prophets, and the evangelists, pastors, teachers, and I believe there is an order there. Now, just so everybody knows exactly what those are, an apostle is someone who actually was with Christ. So Paul is a unique apostle in that he was actually called by Jesus on the road to Damascus personally, and that's why he was an apostle. So after that, after Paul, there can be really no more apostles by definition. Okay, I mean, unless somehow we were to have that kind of miraculous on-site kind of situation again, probably the door is shut for there to be apostles. As to prophets, there's an interesting issue as far as prophets are concerned, because again, prophets are people that are directly called out by God to essentially speak prophecy to the world. Well, in John's book of the Revelation, he says that anyone who adds, at the very end of the book, he says anyone who adds to this revelation beyond this is essentially doing it outside the will of God. So that becomes kind of a little bit of an interesting situation as well. So could there be prophets? Could there be modern day prophets today in the same sense that we would have thought of them in Paul's day or before? I would say probably not again. But then there are basically 3 ministerial positions beyond that, which are evangelists, pastors, shepherds, and teachers. And I think it's interesting that Paul singles out evangelists above pastors and teachers. And I think the reason he does is because it is a much more difficult job, especially in 2,000 years ago. The idea of going from place to place and moving and constantly being on the road and so forth It wasn't like you could just jump in his, in his G4 and go from place to place. This was a situation where, it was a challenge just to go 20 miles oftentimes. You think about just the ruggedness of that particular calling. But I would also suggest that even if you look at modern day evangelists, I'm thinking about people like Billy Graham and the challenges that he had in the job that he had. Just an incredibly difficult job if you really do it the way Paul did it, which was traveling all over the world, which was essentially putting yourself in a position where you would be up for ridicule and scoff just about everywhere you went. Pastors and teachers, my job as a teacher is it's the easiest job there is. I mean, if you think about it, because I don't have to go out there and recruit anybody. I don't have to go out there and pound down doors. I teach to whoever comes. I mean, it's really the easiest job if you think about it. The shepherd's job is really, I think, a lot more difficult than any teacher's job, because one of the reasons people ask me for years, why didn't you ever go into the ministry? That's a kind of an interesting question. I mean, I came to the Lord when I was young. I started teaching when I was about 18 or 19. Why didn't you go into the ministry? And my answer to that is always the same. I do not have the qualifications to be a pastor. It's just that simple. Pastors have to have and we're going to talk about the qualifications of an elder today. Pastors have to have really big time qualifications as far as the ability to work with people. I am not that good settling conflict and those kinds of things. I can be pugnacious, frankly. And so I realized that very early in my life, and so it was pretty clear to me that God was going to use me in different areas. And so you go to your calling. You don't go because it's, you're trying to do this or trying to do that. You go to your calling. And if you're called to do something, that's what you should be doing. When you're not doing what you're called to do is when you have problems. And I meet a tremendous amount of people that are in positions that they are not called to do. And how do we know we have a calling? Clearly, it's based upon one concept, and that is it building up your unique ability? Every single person has a unique God-given ability. That is what a calling is. If you are not maximizing your unique ability, then you are not maximizing your calling by definition. And so we want to be maximizing our calling. We want to be maximizing our unique ability. I have a great friend of mine who says that, this whole thing of strengthening your weaknesses is nice, but the fact of the matter is you should be strengthening your strengths. Because if you strengthen your weaknesses long enough, all you end up with is strong weaknesses. So you need to be focusing on what it is that you do well and really building yourself up in the areas that you do well, because that's when you're going to be used by God. And what you want to do in those areas that you're weak is you want to surround yourself with people that are not weak in those areas. So if you have a strength in hospitality, you should be building up that strength. But if you don't, you should be surrounding yourself with people that have that particular strength. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? So that's really important. So now, what Paul's talking about here in Timothy is not positions of ministry. Everybody got that? It's not positions of ministry. The positions of ministry, according to Ephesians chapter 4, are the ministry positions of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. That's what he's talking about. Here he's talking about an overseer. Now, having said that, an overseer could clearly be one of those people. Paul was clearly an overseer, and he was also an apostle, correct? I would suggest he was also a prophet. I would also suggest he was also a pastor and a teacher and an evangelist. He had all those roles. The guy had no life. But the fact of the matter is that this is a huge undertaking that Paul had. He was clearly all of those people. So just because a person is a pastor, for example, does not mean they can't be an overseer. On the contrary, I think that very often the best people to put in the position of overseer, elder, bishop, whatever you want to call them, could very easily be someone that's in the pastorate. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And we should be building ourselves up with diversity within our leadership, frankly, to where we should have people that are, in fact, just men that meet these very specific qualifications that he gives here. And I'm going to have to tell you something. The qualifications that he gives here, and there are about 15 of them. In Titus, he gives us another list, pretty much the same list. He just adds a few more to it. So it's actually a total of 20 qualifications if you add the two together, between what he teaches to Timothy and then also what he teaches to Titus. And so if you add up these things and you look at that thing, it is Superman. It just is. I mean, absent the flying powers, it's pretty much Superman. Because when you look at this guy that he's talking about here, look at him. First of all, he starts off with saying that this is a trustworthy saying. Now remember, we had said a couple of weeks ago that there are 5 very specific faithful or trustworthy statements in the pastoral epistles. And you can find them in chapter 1, verse 15, where Paul says that it is a trustworthy statement that that God saves sinners, to which I am the greatest. The second one is this one right here, where he says a trustworthy statement that if a person wants to seek the job of an overseer, he's doing a fine thing. So it's something that you should be encouraged to do if you're a man. The third thing he talks about in I believe it's the 1 Timothy chapter 4, in verse 9, he says it's a trustworthy statement, deserving all acceptance, that we serve a living God. That we serve a living God, a God who was human, a God who was human. And so that trustworthy statement is there. He goes on in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11. And this is one of the biggest trustworthy statements, because actually it's a multiple of statements. The statements are, if we died with him, we'll also live with him. If we endure with him, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. So basically what Paul is saying there is that salvation is not based on you. It's totally based upon God. So it is a faithful saying that God cannot deny himself. And then the final one is in the book of Titus, that it is good and is profitable for us to engage in good works. So those 5 faithful sayings that he has, and we'll look at each one of them as we go through them. We're now looking at the second one about being an elder, about being an overseer. That is something that we should be encouraged to do. Now, the first thing we need to understand here is, as Paul said in the previous chapter, this is a job that he is holding out for men. Why? Because if he doesn't, men will not do it. Men will not naturally incline themselves to be the administrator. And I don't know why that is, but it's true. You see it all the time. Men clearly struggle in taking charge in certain areas. In this area of administration and oversight, they clearly do struggle. And so what Paul is saying here is God's got kind of a sense of humor. He's going to make sure that he uses people that are truly called by him. Women, I'm telling you, get the idea of oversight so much quicker than men. They get it. It's easier for them. It's simpler for them. You would say, well, why didn't he just let women do it? And I'm convinced that the reason he doesn't want women to do it is not because he has a problem with women. On the contrary, it's just the opposite. He's got a problem with men. He's like, hey, we got to get these guys off their bums and let's get them to work. And so oversight is something that he is called for men to do. So now he's going to give us a picture of what that man should look like. Okay? And what that man should look like. And when he gets into this, he goes into this in I think, kind of interesting, really interesting detail. But the very first thing that he says is that they should be above reproach. They should be, actually the word is, without something sticking to them. It's actually technically what the Greek word means. Essentially, they should be Teflon. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that if you are an overseer, expect to get a lot of stuff heaved at you, and a lot of accusation, and a lot of people, wanting to, basically, rip you apart. Always second guessing every decision. The one thing that I learned when I actually took on this role at this church when we first got started, was that no matter what you did, if you were on the board, you got criticized for it. It's just a fact. We built this church. We built this building. We built this building. Criticism. You know why? Well, you shouldn't have done this. Why did you put that wall there? You should not have had that closet. Why in the world did you put what a waste of space. Look at all this space you got. Really, literally, this particular room right here was a huge point of controversy. Just cracks me up when I think about it now. This was a point of controversy. We need to split this up into at least 3 or 4 rooms. Look at how much space is here. We could have 3 or 4 different. I'm thinking to myself, not so much. Okay, this room has so much more functionality. I believe in this, but there was a huge amount of folks out there that had a problem. There were folks. I'm just going to pick on somebody in our audience here. No names necessarily, but you'll know exactly what I'm talking about in a second. Someone has a Hapkido class in this room, okay? And there was a whole group of people that were like, well, why are we doing Hapkido in the church? Remember? Why are we doing that? We shouldn't be doing that in our church. Okay. So this is the job of the overseer. This is the job of the elder. Is you are going to get thrown all the most ridiculous haberdashery, you name it, all the garbage. We don't want our pastors having to deal with that. Our pastors have other jobs than wondering whether or not we should have Hapkido in the upper room on Monday nights. Really? And should we really have our pastors doing those things? That's why you have overseers. That's why you have elders, and he's going to go on. He's going to talk about deacons, which are really persons that actually are involved more in the ministerial part of things. But the administrator is the person who basically helps to try to make some of these financial calls and some of the other things. We don't need to have our pastors doing that stuff. And we don't want them to be burdened with that. Now, having said that, this is a great list of things for pastors to have as qualifications as well. I'm not suggesting that these are bad qualifications for anybody in ministry. I'm just saying that if you're going to be in administration, if you're going to be in the job of an overseer, it's a different job than being a teacher or a pastor or an evangelist. It's a different job. It is a thankless job because the first part of it is people are going to throw stuff at you, and you have to be Teflon. You have to be without and above reproach. It's a hard job to do. I failed on the very first qualification. If you're not above reproach, we can't go much further. And so one of the things that I wrote here, and I really believe that this is true, to be a true person who is above reproach, you have to have the mind of a scholar, you have to have the heart of a child, and you have to have the hide of a rhinoceros. I mean, you got to be able to put up with just the most absurd, idiotic little silliness and be able to just let it go off your back. I think the real tragedy is that we don't truly honor people that are in this position. We really don't. They are in the background. Very few people don't even know that they even exist, frankly. Can anybody name the 4 elders of our church? One person in this room could sort of name them. Kind of a behind-the-scenes kind of job. And I picked a rhino only because I was watching a TV documentary, and rhinos are like one of the only animals that a spear will not actually penetrate. The second thing he says is that you should be a husband of one wife. Now, this is an interesting little thing because this has brought up all sorts of controversy over the years as to if someone has been divorced, does that disqualify them from ministry? If they were divorced before they were a believer and then they became a believer and then they got remarried, does that disqualify them from ministry? What if you have never been married? Does that disqualify you from ministry? Whether as an overseer or otherwise. And that's not what this is talking about. What this is talking about is that in Paul's day and age, the idea of having multiple spouses was just the way it was. Almost everybody had 1, 2, 3, especially Gentiles, 1, 2, 3, 4 spouses oftentimes, a couple of concubines on the side. It was not that uncommon. Even the kings of Israel, look at Solomon. Right? Solomon, by definition, would not qualify as an overseer. Okay? How many wives did he have? Like 3,000 or something? I don't know. It's just crazy. He had more concubines than he had wives. The guy was obviously insane. And so what he's talking about here is a one-woman type of guy. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about someone who doesn't necessarily make the idea of having multiple relationships part of his lifestyle. So if a person has had a divorce early on in their life, and then things happen, especially if it wasn't even their fault, the Bible has very clear ways of reconciling a person that has had that challenge in their lives. That's not what he's talking about here. What he's talking about is he's talking about people that don't get the idea of being faithful to one person. And that's really all he's talking about. So you need to learn how to be faithful to one person. If you are never been married, clearly that does not disqualify you. Paul had never been married. So by definition, marriage is not a qualification. What he's saying here is, again, we're looking for guys that are not promiscuous is really the issue. The third thing he talks about is being temperate. And temperate is an interesting word because, especially when you put it in context here of what he's talking about, the word temperate actually means to not get drunk. That's basically what it means. That's pretty much what it means. At the end of the day, people that are temperate don't get drunk. Okay, it's just that simple, actually. And so what he's talking about here, if you read it in the context, listen to what he says. He says, whoops, back over that page. He says, an overseer then must be above reproach, husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, apt to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious. So it's all kind of in context. He's saying, look, I'm looking for guys that are not going to go out and get get drunk with the guys in the bar. We're not, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people that are basically sober, that are temperate, that are in control. Exactly. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for guys that are like this, a little bit more level. We don't need these guys that are just all over the park here. The idea of temperate also, I think, brings out the idea, and I kind of wrote this down myself, of not being excessive. I think one of the biggest problems that we see with many leaders is they get too extreme. So we need to stay away from from picking leaders that are overly extreme. And then the next word he uses there, which is kind of cool because we actually use the word prudent. Now, prudent is a good word for people in my business because there's two key words for people that are in the investment business. The first is prudent. It's called the prudent man rule. And the second is fiduciary, which means always looking out for other people's best interests first. So to be prudent means that you're going to do things which in the exact same circumstance, someone of the same caliber of you would make the same decision. Everybody get that? That's what a prudent man is. Someone who is going to have sound judgment. That when they are faced with the same... So we say our judges should always be prudent. They should make things that are well thought out, that you think of both sides of the issue, that you are looking at it, and then you make a judgment or you make a decision. To be prudent means to make a call. And that is huge. What I'm talking about here is there's an awful lot of people out there who have what I call paralysis by analysis. And we don't need those people in leadership. We need people that are going to look at every situation and then they're going to make a decision. Good, bad, or indifferent. They're going to make a decision. So we need decision makers. And that's what the idea of being prudent here is. It comes from the word sophron. And sophron is a word in Greek that's used quite a bit. But it really actually talks about limiting one's freedom. That's the context of that word. Is to look. The Bible talks about, in Ephesians especially, talks about the fact that we can do all of these things, but we're not going to do those things. I can do this, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to withhold from doing that because it's prudent to do that. It's really in everyone's best interest, and that's where this idea of being a fiduciary, looking out for other people's best interest, really comes together with the idea of prudence. So we want to be both prudent and fiduciary at the same time, always looking for other people's best interest. Everybody see where I'm coming from in that? So, and making a decision. So prudent, the idea behind prudent is that you're looking out for other people's interest, you're limiting your own freedom, but most importantly, you are making a call. You are actually making a decision. And we need that to be there. Respectable. The word respectable there comes from the word cosmos. What's cosmos? Why did the Greeks call it the cosmos? Why did they call the universe the cosmos? Because the word cosmos means order. The cosmos is always in order. One of the things that Plato used to write was that the stars always rise in the same unison in the cosmos, in the order. So that's the whole, and that's where that came from. Plato was actually the one that called the universe the cosmos. It was not called that before. It was a word that just meant order prior to Plato essentially now calling it the universe. It's become so known and so well known that it's actually found its way into English. You can look in the English dictionary, look up the word cosmos, spelled C-O-S-M-O-S, and it is an English word, but it's not really. It's a Greek word, and that Greek word, of course, is dealing with the idea of order. So what Paul is saying here is he's saying, look, I want my guys, what he's essentially saying is I want all of the people that are in leadership to be orderly. Or to use a double negative, not disorderly. Does that make sense? Okay? So I want you to be respectable. I want you to be good. He then uses the word hospitable. I love hospitable, but if you're going to be in ministry, you better be someone that likes people. It's just a fact. Okay? Again, I have to come back to myself here. I'm not sure I really like people. They drive me completely crazy. I mean, they just do, okay? And so I would have a really hard time and challenge of being a pastor, at all times, because I really sometimes have to struggle with the area of hospitality. But I've been blessed with a wife who really has that gift, and so I've surrounded myself in that area. I have to say I've gotten better in this area, but I'm telling you, it is not my natural ability. It's not my natural gift, okay? Okay, so... But you have to be people likers, if there is such a word. To really, but especially to be an elder, you have to be willing to look at people's best sides, and that's really what hospitality is all about. It's really looking at people's best sides. And now it's interesting because the seventh thing that he talks about is having the aptitude to teach. And I think this is fascinating because typically, the first thing that people usually think about when they think about people that are in leadership is their aptitude to teach. Now, basically, and by the way, he doesn't say ability to teach. He says apt or aptitude to teach. In other words, they don't necessarily have to be teachers. They just have to have an aptitude to do it. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? And that's really a big distinction, really, in my opinion. There are a lot of people that have the aptitude to teach, but they don't have the gift of being able to exhort. So you don't have to have the gift of exhortation, which is basically my gift. I have the gift of exhortation. There's no question about it. I mean, I can get up in front of a group. It does not even... I've gotten up in front of tens of thousands of people, and it doesn't even faze me. And I'm not saying that it's just a fact. I mean, I've often wondered why it doesn't faze me. Because I talk to other people that are in the green room, and they'll look at me and they'll go, aren't you afraid? And I'm afraid of what? There's probably not a bomb that's going to explode on stage. I've never had that happen. No one's ever thrown rotten tomatoes. It's not, I don't see it as being that big of a deal. And so for me, it's not a big deal. And I've actually had friends of mine come up to me and they'll say, when you get up in front of groups, you have a presence. It's just no fear. Okay, so it's just sort of what I do. But there are other people who are really able and apt to teach, but they have no ability to get in front of people. That should not disqualify them from being in leadership as far as an overseer. They have the ability to teach, sure, they have the aptitude, but they don't have the exhortation gift. Notice it never says in here anything about exhortation. Did you notice that? You don't have to have the gift of exhortation. You don't have to have the gift of being able to get up in front of people. There are an awful lot of people out there that have disqualified themselves from leadership positions that they probably should be in because they don't think, oh, I couldn't get up in front of people, I couldn't do that. You don't need to. That's not what an overseer does. Overseer doesn't get up and teach. He's got the ability to teach, but not necessarily that big of a deal. But I also think it's really important that if you have the ability to teach, if you have the ability to do that, you should try to always use that gift as much as you can. So maybe it's not in a big public arena, but certainly it can be in a one-on-one. It can be, so having the ability, because almost always overseers are going to ask to counsel people. They're going to be asked to do that. That's just part of the job, one-on-one. So they have to be hospitable and they have to be apt to teach. They have to be able to do that. Then the next thing he talks about there is not addicted to wine. And I think this is really a kind of an important issue as well, because again, in Paul's day and age, there was a different thinking about the drinking of wine than in many than in our society, especially over in the last, say, 100 years, especially in this country. Again, I come back to what we talked about last week, that oftentimes what we have is influenced by puritanical thinking from 400 years ago. And the Puritans actually taught, hey Bob, how are you? Come join us. The Puritans actually taught that liquor, specifically wine, was evil. And so that kind of has, kind of worked its way through the economy. There are many, many people that, even to this day, especially older people, that think that if a pastor were to drink wine or to drink any kind of alcoholic beverage, that would be something that would disqualify them from their ministry. That's their opinion. That's just the way they were raised. That's their culture. But certainly that was not the case in Paul's time. In Paul's time, almost everybody drank wine because it was the only thing that you could drink that wasn't... water was not really much of an option back in those days. And so you had to be really, really careful about not overindulging on wine, because even if you were drinking new wine, there still had some alcohol content to it. And you had to be careful not to overdo, because again, it comes back to temperance. Everybody see that? Okay, it comes back to that. So what he's saying here is we don't want to be alcoholic. We do know that 1 out of every 14 people are addicted to alcohol in this country. Did you know that? 1 out of every 14 people in this country are addicted to alcohol. It is one of the most addictive things in our economy or our society. And so there are those people that would say, why take the chance that, it's like putting 14 rounds in a revolver and, spinning the revolver and putting it up to your head. Do you want to take that chance? Again, I don't go that extreme. That's not my place. But the fact is that 1 out of 14 people, those are the statistics, are addicted to alcohol in this country. Addiction is a huge area that we have to be careful of, and it doesn't just find itself in alcohol. Obviously, addiction to drugs and so forth, but addiction to all sorts of different issues. What he's saying here is don't get addicted. So if you have a person that has an addictive personality, if they are 1 of the 14, that really should disqualify them for this job. And that means just find another job. That's really what it means. And I don't want you to take that the wrong way. But the truth is that really does disqualify you for the job. If you're a person that has an addictive personality, or you've had problems with addiction, probably should not be an overseer. Why? Because it's a very painfully difficult job. And it's very easy to fall back on those things. So, again, wine is not the problem. Excess, addiction is the problem. And that's what he's talking about here. The next thing he talks about is being gentle or not pugnacious, uncontentious. And this is really what Clark was just talking about. We just have them reversed in a little different order here. But the idea of being gentle is the word not striking. That's actually what was in my definition in New American Standard is gentle. It actually means not to strike. Pugnacious. I think everybody knows what the word pugnacious is. Obviously, that's someone who is a fighter. And so the idea of being pugnacious, being a fighter, we're not looking for that. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't bring guys up that are willing to stand up for what they believe in. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about here are brawlers. People are going to get into a fight. They're going to start slugging people. They're going to and so we don't need those kind of people. What we're looking for people that really have a gentleness about them. In fact, they're going to be the people that go in and break up the brawl. That's what our overseers should look like. They're the ones that step into the brawl, not to get fought, not to punch somebody, but maybe even to get punched, so that someone else doesn't get punched. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's really what he's talking about here. That's the idea of not being contentious. Then he gets into the thing about money here next. Okay, so after he goes through this thing about not being pugnacious, being gentle, not being a person that's a striker, he says, look, I really, really want you to understand that money is a problem. And it's not money in it. It's like wine. Wine's not the problem. Excess is the problem. Money's not the problem. Greed is the problem. Greed is the problem. And that's why he calls it filthy lucre. I think that's kind of an interesting expression. By the way, that is literally what the Greek says. Filthy lucre. Okay? So the King James has got it right. Everybody else changes it to be free from the love of money and all that other kind of stuff. But the King James, what does the King James say?
I jumped through.
Oh, you jumped through. Okay. Anybody got the King James here? Because it's really.
Not greedy of filthy lucre.
Yeah, not greedy of filthy lucre. I love that. Okay, that is literally what the Greek says. Okay, and so we have to understand that this is all about me. That's what he's saying here. If you have money because it's all about me, that's a problem. Money is there for God's use, not for your use. A person that's in ministry, certainly one that's in this area of administration and oversight, should be the person clearly that understands that the money is not for them. Money is not for them. Does not mean they can't be rich, by the way. They could be filthy rich, but just not greedy. Again, it's all about your control. Yeah, it comes back to, good call. So we need to understand that we're really stewards of God's money. That's really, the concept that he has there. And then he gets into this next thing, and I purposely tried to stay so we'd have a little bit of time to talk about this. He says, verse 4, he must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity, because how can a man manage? How can a man, if he does not manage his own household, take care of the church of God? If there has ever been a section of Scripture that is really misunderstood, it's this section. I have had a friend of mine whose son was probably from the time he was 6 or 7 years old, has just been a pain in the butt. I just can't even explain it anymore. The kid is he was always difficult. He started doing drugs by the time he was about 13. His father was in ministry. Father just did everything he possibly could and so forth. Sent him off to rehab. Did everything he possibly could for this particular child. Ended up selling all sorts of illicit drugs. Ended up in jail, and today is serving a pretty significant sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. That father felt that he needed to disqualify himself from ministry because he violated this rule. He's like, if I can't even care for my own, if I can't keep my own kid out of jail, how in the world can we do this? And I am very glad to say he was actually part of Calvary Chapel, and or is part of Calvary Chapel, excuse me, because he's still in ministry. And Chuck Smith would not kick him out of ministry. And here's why. Now, Chuck is long gone now, but this was before, obviously when Chuck was still really the guy that was sort of overseer of the whole entire thing. And he said no. And here's why. He went through, Chuck did, and he examined what this father tried to do. He tried to do everything that he possibly could to get this kid on the straight and narrow, to get this kid away from where he was headed. But the son was bound and determined to be pugnacious and to be the prodigal son. It was just the way it was going to be. I've often thought that he did it to ruin his father's ministry, to literally drive him out of that ministry. I really believe there was something to that. But again, that's just my supposition. But I will say this. Chuck said something, and I've never forgotten it. If you are the governor of California, you're going to have citizens that do things which get them put in jail. That does not mean that you're a bad governor. You do what you're supposed to do. You make the decisions that you're supposed to make. You do the punishment that you're supposed to send down. And he did. He actually made his son leave his house when he was 18 years old. He took away basically all of his rights, his inheritance, whatever. He did everything he possibly could to try to get his son to realize that this was just a bad path. But he just wouldn't listen. That does not mean he was not doing his job as a father. It just meant that the son didn't take the leadership. So just because a son or a daughter goes sideways does not necessarily, in and of itself, condemn the parent or the governor. Does everybody see where I'm coming from there? Okay. That's the key that he's talking about here. Is he's saying, look, are you doing the thing? We're not focused. I had another guy once tell me, a golf teacher, don't ever focus on results. Always focus on process. Always focus on process. If you want your results to get good, focus on process, because that will ultimately bring good results. If you only focus on what you do, you're going to be frustrated. The result. You got to focus on what causes that to happen. I remember him just using a very simple analogy. I remember him saying, if the ball is going to the left, it's because when the club face hits the ball, it's got to be pointing to the left. I went, oh, that's pretty creative. He says, he goes, so what are we going to focus on? And I said, not having the club face hit it with it being shut. And he said, no, that's not what we're going to focus on. What we're going to focus on is what causes it to get shut in the first place. Everybody see this? So we're going to focus on the coming back, not the coming through. I have to tell you, that single little bit of information was life-changing. Life-changing for me. You don't have to know anything about golf to understand this analogy. This analogy of you can't fix what's happening at 120 miles an hour unless you can fix what's happening at 2 miles an hour. Buddy, see where I'm headed? It's this part going back that we had to fix. And when that happened, suddenly the club face wasn't shut anymore. So I was trying to get the club face not shut. No. I couldn't do that because that was focusing on results. Everybody see what I'm saying? And I thought it was focusing on process. Because I said, I'm not focusing on the ball. I'm focusing on the club face. No. You're still focusing on results. You got to focus on the process. So he had me literally doing these little teeny moves where I'd go 6 inches with the club. 6 inches going backwards. And I'd stop. And he'd go, nope, that's off. We only went 6 inches. Nope, that's off. And I'm going, ah! Okay? And then all of a sudden, it just dawned on me. It just dawned on me. And it was like, oh, man, there's the move. Boom. And you know what's really weird is today, even to this minute, right this second, I can see that move. And if I do that move correctly, I know the club face is not going to be shut. Now, I'm not trying to make this into a golf lesson, okay? I want you guys to understand it's about process. It's about process. It's about literally getting those things and the easy part, that's when you fix stuff. You don't fix it going 120 miles an hour. Doesn't happen. If we want to have kids that are going to be, men and women of God, we need to do all we possibly can to give them all of the opportunity to do that. But at the end of the day, that result is not my decision. Now, having said that, I also believe, however, that you can tell a lot about a person based upon his kids or her kids. I really believe that. I believe there is a very real tie between how a father acts and how his children act out. I believe there is a real close correlation. Is it always that way? No, clearly not. But by the same token, this expression, the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, is not that far away. So there is so we, when we're examining whether a person really is governing his household, we don't do it based upon results, but we do it based upon the process that they use within their family. And I am convinced that more often than not, if you have the right process, you will have a square club face. And that's the kids. Does everybody see what I'm talking about here? Okay? So that's what he's talking about. So don't ever get into this thing of judging somebody based upon if you don't know all the details. But by the same token, if a person just lets his kids run wild, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. That's about governance. Just like if the governor allows people to just go for it throughout his entire state, that's a problem with the governor. He should be kicked out. And so that's kind of where we're at. The final two things that he talks about are not a novice and having a good reputation. And these are really about, if you think about it, not a novice is, you don't want people in leadership that are new. Look, I am very confident every time I get on an airplane because I am confident that the person who's flying the airplane is not a novice. I'm confident that they're not going to put somebody in the left seat who hasn't gone through the proper kind of training and the proper kind of instruction and knows what in the world he's doing. Okay? Do we all agree with that? That's what we need in our leadership as far as our churches, whether it's our pastors or whether, but specifically in our elders. We need to make sure we don't just put somebody in because he looks good. That 22-year-old hotshot man, we're gonna raise that guy up to eldership. No. Paul uses the word overseer, but Peter actually uses the word elder, which means old person. Okay, that's what it really means. Okay, so not a novice. And then finally, every single person that's in ministry, whether they be a pastor, an overseer, a deacon, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. Evangelist, they must have a good reputation in the community. One of the things I remember most about Billy Graham, probably more than any other thing that I remember about Billy Graham, is that Billy Graham had a reputation that was sterling. Would you agree with that? You can say anything you want about his doctrine. You can say anything about, but the man had a reputation that was sterling. Governors, presidents, regular people, everybody, you name it. That guy had a reputation that was sterling. Even to this day, where he's, totally disabled. But the fact is, he still has a sterling reputation. When he passes away, I believe his funeral will be attended by heads of state. Would you agree? Yeah, I mean, it's really that. So to have a reputation is essential. I think that, to me, is really the most important thing. If people are in your club and they come to you and ask you to pray for them, that is a reputation. That's a reputation, and that's good. That's a good thing. If people in your business come to you and they say, hey, I'm not sure I get this, but I know you really are kind of like this religious person. Maybe could you maybe throw one up to God for me? I had that happen to me just last week. Yeah, actually, what he said, would you throw one up to God for me? I thought that was really kind of cute. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Reputation. People should know who you are. I have a friend of mine who once said that if you got convicted or you were brought up on charges of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Isn't that neat? So again, we come back to that. So this picture of Superman that we've laid out for you today is just that. It's a picture of Superman. But I think it's a good picture. And it's a picture that every guy should, and I use the word guy here. I use the word man here. This is a picture that every man should try to say in his own life, I want to be that person. I want to be that person that is blameless. I want to be that person that is not pugnacious, that is gentle, that is apt to teach, that is kind, that has a great reputation, that has children that really want to serve God. That's the kind of person I would want to be. Your father has got to be extremely proud of the fact that he has a whole lineage of children and grandchildren that walk with God. True? He's got to be very proud of that. And that to me is a very, very essential thing, and that's proud in the good sense of the word pride. Okay, not in the bad sense. So that's kind of where we're at. I know this is a lot. We tried to cover a little bit of ground today. I didn't want to spend a lot of weeks on this particular, because I think it really is all one person. So that's where we're at. Any questions before we go? Any comments? No? Lots of stuff here. So there it is. But again, it comes right down to this: are you a person that wants to walk with God? So I really believe if you're a person that really wants to walk with God, all these other things become almost automatic. And that's really what Paul is bringing out. So next week we'll look at deacons and women, which should be kind of fun. And let's end in a word of prayer. Walter, would you pray for us?
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for Paul's teaching here on what the qualifications are to oversee churches. I pray, Lord, that each one of us would strive to be, as Don said, Superman. And where we fall short in any of these areas, that we would strive to improve or to change our lives and have a reputation that is blameless in front of others. We ask that you would allow us to enjoy the season that we're in and the celebration of the birth of your Son, and bring us back here New Year's and continue studying your word. In your name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right.